All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Keisha Jones. I'm currently a graduate student in the CSAL program at Grand Valley. I'm also the communications officer in the graduate school for GSA and welcome you all. So basically today for this session, we will be having the topic will basically be remote interviews and networking along with both of our presenters. Um, I want to pronounce them both right. So Amy and we have Marnie. Is that how you pronounce it? Yep. Okay. Well, basically, they're going to be talking about just remote interviews and networking today. Um, and welcome. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
tuning in. So
So
I hand
I'm
it.
looking at the list of participants and I see some familiar names from the last couple of weeks, which is wonderful. But there may be some new people here. So I just want to quick introduce myself and let Amy also introduce herself for those of you who haven't seen us before. My name is Marnie Vin and I'm with Chosen Resumes. I'm located here in Grand Rapids and I'm a certified professional resume writer working with people across industries and all professional levels. And here to share with you some career readiness information to help all of you as you complete your grad programs to start your careers or continue your careers for those of you who are already working. Amy.
Hi, thank you. My name is Amy Adler. I have a company called Five Strengths Career Transition Experts. I am also a resume writer with Master Resume Writing Certification. And same, so excited to be here for round number 3 to offer what we can on the subject of networking and interviewing, which I think we hope that we will lead you all to see that they are on a continuum, very similar pieces. And I'm very grateful to be here, so thanks.
So as Amy gets her slides up to share with you, and we'll walk you through the presentation, I just want to let everyone know that we love this to be interactive. So please use the chat function, drop questions in there, and we will try to answer them throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait till the end. And we want to start you off with a question just to get started right away is when you think about interviewing or networking, what are some of your pain points? What are the challenges? What's holding you back? So if you wouldn't mind, just share with us some thoughts to get us so we know exactly how best we can help you and make sure that we cover it in the presentation. So take a minute and just type into the chat, what do you find most challenging or what do you struggle most with interviewing and networking? So we'll let those come in and we'll get started and we'll answer and respond to those throughout the presentation. So Amy.
So I wanted to start with a story. When I was actually standing in a position not probably so different from where you are right now, I was in the last semester of a graduate program and I was looking for my first job. So I was interviewing where I could and trying to figure out what the next thing was going to be. And I recall at the time, the backdrop is that I was working on a master's thesis. So I had this big project going on. And after the interview questions that this interviewer had sort of put out all the typical kinds of interview questions, he said to me, "Oh, by the way, tell me about your thesis. Oh, and this is not part of the interview." And I, being me and maybe with not enough filters at the moment, retorted, I think is the best term, retorted, "There's no such thing as not part of the interview." Needless to say, I didn't get the job, but probably I didn't belong there anyway. And it's funny, it became a funny story, sort of historically speaking, because I didn't know anything about job search, particularly at the time, but I thought about my retort, if you will, over the years. And I repeated the story a lot because I think it speaks to a very real circumstance that everything you do is part of the interview. Every step that you take from the moment you have an interaction with somebody via email or Zoom or phone call or face-to-face, whatever it's going to be, even when that person is just a networking contact before it's a full-on interview, everything's part of the interview. Everything you do counts. And it's a good idea to remember that everything adds up in the end. And you have to be mindful of all those things. So that was my story.
And we'll talk later too about the, just from the second you either turn on the Zoom or answer the phone or show up at the office, everything is going to be, you're going to be evaluated. So we'll talk more about that later. But let's start kind of at the basics. And I just want to acknowledge, I really appreciate people's honesty and transparency here with what they're struggling with. And we'll talk about those throughout the presentation. So we'll get there, but keep them coming if you have other thoughts on what's difficult in networking and interviewing. So, networking has a lot of different goals, right? So we're going to talk about specifically networking for your job search. And really it's about who you know. So who do you know? Who knows someone you should know? It's kind of a mouthful, but it's basically like the 6 degrees of separation. So you might not know someone directly at the company where you want to work, but you might know someone, a second-degree connection. And of course, LinkedIn and those types of tools can help you with that. But the first step is to identify who's in your network. We have a list here of, friends, relatives, and everyone, from the mailman on out who can be part of your network. And so we encourage you to be creative, whether it's your hairdresser, your financial advisor, an attorney. There's just so many different people who could be part of your network. And so create a list. The list could be your LinkedIn profile. And if you don't have one, get one. And here again, is in the second bullet are some examples of, past employers, customers, colleagues, students, professors. You have a lot of people in your network that you may not realize. And so we just encourage you to sort of be creative and think about how you can expand your connections and leverage them. So we'll talk about how to leverage them in a little bit. But let's go to the next slide where we're going to talk about, once you have your network, and once you've gotten that interview, what does that look like? Amy, you want to walk us through that?
So there are so many modalities, and this was pre-COVID, but I think COVID has changed everything. Everybody's gotten much more comfortable with the way we communicate. So you can expect that the networking process, the connections that you're making, the way Marnie was just describing, with everyone, again, from the mailman to your cousin to your uncle's colleague, whatever it's going to be, all the conversations that you have ultimately will lead to the kinds of conversations in which somebody's evaluating you. So the way interviews used to be back in the day, back before COVID, and when meeting face-to-face was sort of the norm, conversations might have started over the phone, but they would almost immediately turn into coffee meetings or meetings in a conference room or a panel interview or that kind of a thing. And now we're in this circumstance in which companies are using technology. If it's okay, I'll tell a story of a client who had a video interview yesterday. So this is fresh information. It was wholly technology based. So there's all kinds of systems out there now. And my understanding is that the way the virtual interviews go is that the companies upload their questions, they upload the list of candidates, and each candidate that they're considering gets the questions, and then everybody has to do this on their own time or at a scheduled appointment. I guess it can go both ways. My client said she felt like she was talking to herself. And anybody who's ever been on a Zoom doing a conversation in which maybe they're sharing their screen or they can't see the other person, it's a little off-putting to have to talk to yourself and smile and be vibrant and answer the question without a lot of ums and ahs, and not knowing what the questions are going to be makes that even more challenging. So knowing yourself, and we'll talk about how this all works, but knowing yourself, practicing in front of an empty Zoom just by yourself is probably a good idea, because we don't do this in normal interaction. We don't talk to well, maybe we talk to ourselves, but we don't talk to ourselves on camera. So the technology can get in the way. And as a matter of fact, my client said that her technology hung up a couple times. And it was very difficult and sort of rattling because she was navigating this complex technology environment as well as trying to put up a good impression for everyone. So maybe in the chat, you could let us know if you've ever experienced one of these virtual interviews. I had another client, this was about a year and a half ago, probably pre-COVID. She was doing a virtual interview and she had a chalk outline of herself on the screen that she had to fit her head and shoulders into. And she said it was like somebody drew a line around her, and she kind of kept trying to go like this and get in the right spot and get it to focus properly. So what are your experiences? What have you all experienced as far as virtual interviewing? Do you know this routine well? What do you think?
I'll read some of the comments because, one person said that they, afraid they're going to ramble in these types of things. And especially if you're not face-to-face and you don't get that feedback or the visual, the body language cues of the other person, you could tend to ramble. And there's some other, let's see, someone wrote about times you don't have any clue about a few things or not prepared and how to deal with it. So we'll talk about that also. But certainly, I think, it's sort of common knowledge, common sense, but I think the most important thing to do is just practice. If you're worried about rambling, if you're not sure exactly how to say what you want to say, just practice and practice and practice until you feel like you can say what you want to say succinctly. And then there's that elevator pitch someone just mentioned in there too.
And getting kicked out.
Oh, yes. Oh, the technology certainly adds a complexity there. And, like Amy said, each company has its own version for these, interviews. So you might have to fit yourself within a certain, place on the screen, or you might actually be with a person. You might be just sort of talking to yourself. You might have 30 seconds to answer and it's, recorded within a certain time frame. So you have to be sort of adaptable. And again, that practice is just going to be so important to you feeling comfortable and feeling ready and doing well.
And if you think about the fact that they're watching the video interviews of every candidate who responded to their inquiry, you have to stand out somehow. So poise and thoughtful responses, dare I say shorter versus longer responses, these are what are going to capture their attention and be flavorful and exciting and less vanilla than somebody who's wondering, am I there? Is this working? Anybody out there doing those kinds of things, which maybe are less appealing, shall we say, to somebody who's looking for a professional presence.
I think they also want to get a sense of who you are, right? They just want to know who you are as a person because they're assessing cultural fit as well as skills. So, it's hard to just sort of relax and be yourself. But you do want a little bit of your personality and your energy to come through. So again, practicing is going to be how you get good at doing that, because this screen is a bit of an impediment, right? If you're face to face with somebody over coffee or in an office and you can, interact with them, it's much easier to share who you are. But I think the practicing can really help. Okay,
and that will, I was going to respond to the latest question about particular questions that somebody might get asked in an interview. They're going to be very specific. I think the most common is the behavioral interview. And if you're studying your own resume, you're going to know exactly what to say in response to the kinds of questions for the types of roles that you're interviewing for.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a minute, Amy. We'll that behavioral types of questions and what types of questions you might get asked. We have a slide for that and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But let's go to the next one and talk about the purpose of the job interview and the fit. They're assessing, like I mentioned, the competencies, chemistry, and compensation are kind of the three C's to really address the fit. Amy, do you want to add to what they're looking, what companies are looking for?
Sure. So let's assume that inviting you for an interview is taking up someone's resources and time. So they're not going to interview you unless they think you know how to do the job already, or they think you're going to learn to grow into that job. They're not going to interview you if they think you cannot do that role. So if the interview isn't about, can you do this job? The interview has to be about something else. And as Marnie said, it's about fit. Are you the kind of person who could fit in this culture, in this company, in this industry, in this role, in this team? Or if I'm the boss, can I work with you? To what extent do you meet the expectations of somebody who does well in this type of opportunity? So know that they already understand your capability, another C, but let's let these 3 C's guide the way you think about the things you say, with the knowledge, I should footnote this, that compensation should come up eventually, but not for you. Let somebody else bring that up before you do. But it's going to be there. So know that it's in the background, even if we're not talking about it front and center in the first interview.
And Amy, I think we've talked about it being a two-way street, right? They're assessing you as a potential client, but you also need to determine whether this is an environment where you want to show up every day, you know, where you want to work. So it's really a two-way street.
Absolutely. You get to decide too. You get to make your own choices. They're not going, they are evaluating whether they think you're the right person for them. And you can have the same level of thoughtfulness around the fit as they do.
Right. And as much as you might be nervous during the interview, you know, it will probably be something after the fact that when you decompress after the interview where you can, you know, kind of do some reflection on what you heard, what you learned, and then do some assessing, you know, whether it's the good, you know, it works both ways, whether you want to be there and obviously whether they want you is out of your control after the interview, but yeah, definitely keep that in mind as part of your process. So I just want to clarify about, there's a difference between informational interviews and job interviews. And when I've talked to some of my clients, they didn't necessarily know what an informational interview was. So I just want to clarify for anyone here today that you may reach out to people in your network who don't necessarily they're not in a hiring position. They don't, you know, necessarily have a particular job in mind for you, but they're a good person for you to know. So it's like a networking type interview, but also informational in that you're learning from them about their work. So maybe you have an informational interview with somebody who's doing the job that you want to eventually do. So you can kind of pick their brain and learn about that job, or they work for a company that you'd like to work for. They may not have a job ready for you, but just by knowing them and getting information about that company, it could open doors for you down the road. So those sort of informational interviews, that's where your resume can still come into play. You can share it with them, your LinkedIn profile, share it with them. And hopefully it will lead to job interviews. So Amy, do you want to talk about let's go back and let's talk more about the research on how to prepare for these types of conversations. Do you want to walk us through that?
So walking into any kind of networking circumstance should have you with the mindset of real curiosity, but a real foundation for the kinds of things that are easy to find out about a company or a person. So the research that you do can support that. So looking at someone's LinkedIn profile, looking at a company's website, figuring out if there was anything in the news about someone in the organization or something the company did. Their press releases can help you out. Local journals can help you out. Other contacts in the industry might know something that will be helpful. That will give you a lot of fodder for the kinds of questions that you should be asking someone who can tell you more, something that's not written down, something that's not on the website in the kind of way that a company's mission statement might be. So having taking the time to do that will give you the kinds of questions that set people to talking. And the best thing you can do in a networking or an informational interview context is get people to talk. They have knowledge you don't. They have information you don't. And asking them questions about them, about their career paths, about their company, will invite them to do exactly what they want to do, which is honestly talk about themselves.
And I just want to add, somebody, Rashmi had asked about if you have feedback for the company. So say you're in an interview and they want to know if you've done your research, right? And say that you find something um, out either about their social media page or something about the company that you feel like you could add value to that company in certain ways. Is it okay to point out those ways that they could improve and how to approach that? And I do think that you want to show how you could add value. So, whether it's, I'm switching now from the informational interview into the job interview. But if you can demonstrate how you can add value in a job interview, that if you can solve their business problems, that's going to make you a valuable member of their team. So I just wanted to respond to Rashmi about that. And Amy, do you have any examples or clients who've done that in either a cover letter or an interview where they've talked about how they can add value to the company and solve their business problems?
I think I have. I'd say it's a fine line between offering up really good information about what you know how to do and the things you can do well, and maybe touching on a hot button at an organization before you really know them. So I would just be thoughtful about what you say. And maybe the cynic in me also says, don't work for free. If they're offering, if they want you to come in and do work of some type, meaning have prepared information, or they're asking questions about their business in the interview, be mindful of what that means for the interaction. It is cynical of me to say it, but I've heard more questions, more examples of that than I have of companies I know, sort of doing what Rashmi is saying, that they're saying, what do you think about our stuff, and being kind of on the up and up about it. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for candidates to be forthcoming about the things they know very, very well, and be very open about what they know how to do and the expertise they bring.
Good. So once you have done the research about the company, now it's time to do research about yourself. So let's look at the next slide, and really knowing yourself well, right? So how do you explain who you are and your value? And this sort of touches on some of the comments Juliana said. What are some tips for creating my brand? Some people struggle with selling yourself or your brand. How do you introduce yourself without seeming disingenuous? So, obviously you want to be as authentic as possible. So I'm hoping that this slide will, help to answer some questions that you guys have posed. But this again is having a good, strong resume and going through that thoughtful, reflective process of creating a branded, accomplishment-focused resume will help you to prepare for the interviews. And I tell my clients that all the time, because you have really looked back at your different work experiences, your educational experiences, and you've assessed, where did I succeed? What did I do well? What would my coworkers say about me? Those types of things. And all of that information can help to inform your brand. So that's what you want to help to identify. And if your resume isn't there yet, I would say, spend some time working on it, and that will help you because obviously you need that resume to get the interview. And then as a bonus, having a good, strong resume will also help you feel more prepared in articulating who you are and what you have to offer. Amy, do you have any more to add about that? I feel like we'd like to give some more specifics about that. But I think those questions, on the slide can help you think about it, right? What sets you apart? What problems can you solve? That sort of thing.
I think on the networking side, this is a good time to start jotting down the kinds of things that your networking contact is telling you, because they're offering up what they think is important about their industry, about their company, about the kind of role that this is, and using those, let's call them pieces of advice, even though they're not probably intending to be pieces of advice, but use that as a strong filter of your own experience, so that you can then, in the next round, talk about the things that matter to a person like that before they even offer it up. So if they're saying one of the biggest things in our industry is whatever it is, start thinking about what that is. And then the next time you have an interview or a networking experience, you can, if they ask you, start talking about the ways that you solve problems like that, or that you or your company is addressing problems like that, or you've experienced situations like that in the past. It'll be a good platform for additional conversation.
It's like insider information, right? Like knowing a little bit, basically doing your research, right? And sort of knowing what interests them. And so you can craft your message around that. So why don't we talk about some of the questions that could be asked? And I know that somebody, oh, here, I think it was Sina, had asked about questions in an interview and techniques to answer them. So this is the slide for you. So here's that tell me about yourself type question. This is where you need your elevator pitch, right? Where you can use that resume as your starting point. Make sure you know your brand. Practice it in front of an empty Zoom screen where you can, talk to yourself and not feel like it's totally awkward. And try not to ramble, right? So you want it to be basically crafted for them, right? Like you have a story and it's yours, but you want to tell them what's most interesting to them. Amy, do you have more about, that how to answer that question of tell me about yourself? It is so open-ended.
It's open-ended, and it might be the hardest one, I think, in an interview. And it's always the first one. So I often advise job seekers to have a couple of versions ready. And putting it the first round, so they might say, Marnie, tell me about yourself. So you might start talking about whatever you want to say about yourself. Perhaps after 15 or 30 seconds, maybe no more, a job seeker might say, I really want to tell you about something I've done, some experience I've had. May I tell you about it? And what the person is doing in that context is giving the interviewer a choice. They could say, yeah, I'd really love to know about the time that you did whatever this thing is. Or they might say, you know what, I'm really interested to know more about this other point on your resume, or this other circumstance or thing that's happened, this industry experience that you might have. And you're kind of leading them by saying, may I tell you more about this? And they get the chance to then guide the conversation. You're kind of giving them the controls back a little bit, but in such a way that it is polite and fluent, or fluid, I guess, and enables you to talk about the things you want to talk about if they say yes, but gives them the chance to tell you where to go if not. And then you're not just stuck rambling to the point of that question for 30 or 40 more seconds on stuff they're not interested in.
It makes it a little bit more interactive, like an actual conversation at that point. And someone asked Juliana, how long should I talk to tell, for how long should you talk when answering that question, tell me about yourself? And I would say 30 seconds, right, at the most. You're going to give them the overview. I'm a student. I have this kind of work experience. I'm, really passionate about A, B, and C. In my work or studies, I've been able to accomplish blah. And, and you're looking for a career in, or, that where you're excited to go. So I think that's kind of, those are some of the bare bones of like at a very high level of the touch points in an elevator pitch.
I think you nailed it though with the first two words, I am a. That's a great way to start. I am a resume writer. I am a job search coach. I am a whatever. I am an operations expert. I am a marketing person. I'm an accountant. And then you can elaborate from there, but it gives them some signposts and gives you an opportunity to frame the kind of accountant that you are, the kind of marketing person you are.
And Karen asked about strengths finders and other diagnostics that sort of reveal a little bit of your personality and your strengths. So I don't know if I would necessarily lead with those, because if the other person isn't familiar with that diagnostic tool, then it might not, they might not connect with them. But I think you could certainly weave it in, I fall on, here in Strength Finders or Myers-Briggs. And, as a result, it really helps me in a work environment to do X, solve problems, or, be a bridge between different departments, or, drive operational improvement, whatever it is. Use what your Strength Finders is as part of the explanation of what you can do and what you have done. Amy, would you agree with that?
I think that's really helpful to use it as sort of a support structure for the kinds of behavioral interview questions that the person's likely to get. Tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time when you had to be a connection between warring factions. You might say, one of my strengths is, and follow on from there.
What about the, what kind of, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? That was one of the, Jerry mentioned that.
Right.
Those kinds of questions. I mean, I don't even, do people even still want to use those? I mean, I think what they're trying to do is assess, sometimes they'll ask questions about, like, if you had to figure out the height of a building and you couldn't use measuring tape, or, some sort of measurement tool, how would you do it? And they want to see, like, how you solve problems, how you think. And so I think that tree question is probably also like, how do you think? How do you, and how do you see yourself, right? So as silly as those are, I would say if you could try to embrace it and use it in a way to show your strengths, even if it is a ridiculous question. If it's a ridiculous question that's crossing the line, asking something illegal, that's a different story. But if it's just something silly about what kind of tree would you be, they have a reason for asking it. And I would say, try to use that to your advantage. So did you have something else, Amy, before we go on?
Oh, just on the notion of illegal questions. If they ask it, you don't have to answer it. But if you open the door to the question or the topic, they can continue. So maybe don't open those doors. That's all.
And should we give a summary of what types of questions would be illegal for those who might not know?
I'm sure there are comprehensive lists out there, but
yeah,
all sorts of things from marital status to, I don't know, whether you own a car. I think they can also ask if you have reliable transportation, but not whether you know how to drive. I think there's all sorts of questions that cross equal opportunity kinds of lines. Same interview as the one I was mentioning earlier. I got asked if I was getting married.
Yeah,
because
that's inappropriate.
What?
That's inappropriate.
Yeah. So the reason I didn't want the job is because I didn't want to work for somebody who was concerned about my marital status. But I think I blew it anyway by being as forthright as I was. So.
Well, let's talk about some of the other questions that could be asked, like job specific. Do you want to talk us through that, Amy?
Ooh, sorry. So you're going to know the kinds of job specific requirements from the roles that you're seeking, because you'll have done that in the process of writing your resume. You're going to be thinking about the kinds of roles, the overlap of those types of roles. Even if they're not identical, they're going to have some similar hallmarks that you can use to initially write your resume, and then to think about as you're going into the interview. And you're going to know what skills and assets those interviewers are going to ask about. So having stories ready for the kinds of skills that come up all the time in the types of roles that you're looking for. So if it's accounting, maybe it has something to do with GAAP. Maybe it has something to do with the technologies behind accounting, what the accounting softwares that people are using these days, and the ways that you know how to use those and integrate those into, let's say, ERPs or other types of technologies. You know these are coming, so it is wise for you to have a handful of sentences at the ready that shows that you know how to do these things, that you've done it before, and that you can do it again. So companies are not above all the time taking chances on people who haven't done the kinds of things they're looking for. It's not that they're not willing to ever take risks, but companies are much more comfortable when they know that the person they're talking to is a sure thing. They know that this person has accounts payable and accounts receivable experience. They know that this person has ERP experience or whatever it's going to be. That makes them happy. It makes them feel very confident that they're looking at the right type of candidate. And if you can show them that you are checking all their boxes from a skills standpoint, that's going to help them very much.
And then even if you don't have the skills, if you can explain to them why the skills you do have can still work in that role, that's where the transferable skills come in. And you want to be able to, again, like Amy said, prepare some stories, some examples, explain and help connect the dots for them. And we've got the last one is the interpersonal, and we talked a little bit about that with the strength finders, but they're going to want to know a little bit about your personality. How are you going to fit in with the work culture and in the corporate culture on the team and that sort of thing. So, Amy and I think talked the first week about this framework of CAR, challenge, action, result. And that's really important on a resume to make sure that you're showing results. But that also is a great structure or framework for interviews. Talk about a challenge, what you did as the action, and then what the result was. And so that can work in, the job specific or the interpersonal, any of these, you should have some stories ready for challenge, action, result. So let's move on to the curveball. And I also want to throw out a question that someone asked about, what are your weaknesses? So how do you answer that question? I hate that one. Amy, what do you counsel your clients?
On the weaknesses?
Yeah.
It's the worst. It feels like a fabricated question. It's designed to trip somebody up because there's really no good way of answering it that doesn't sound like the humble brag, right? Like, it used to be that I was really disorganized and my desk was really messy, but I learned the value of putting my papers where they belong. I mean, that's just, I think if anybody ever asks this question, the only things that you can bring to the table on that are going to be issues that have nothing to do with the current job and that happened a long time ago. There's no, you don't have to offer them a reason to reject you. I'm an accounting person, but I'm really bad at math. Like, that's not a good one. That's not going to help.
What about like if you're applying for a very team-oriented job and you are a very collaborative, person who would be a good match for this team-oriented job. So, could you say that one of your weaknesses, it would be like working alone and working in isolation, because that you're not going to be, saying something negative because that that's not going to trip up your chances for getting this job.
Yeah, but then you also have to be careful because there's going to be times where everybody has to do work independently and has to be self-motivated. Mm-hmm. So maybe something like that would be, I've learned over years ways to jumpstart my day so I can get a ton done on my own. So I have the energy and the wherewithal, the mental space to work in teams where I rightly belong. And that's where I do my best work. But I know that I have to get these other things done first. So I've learned to structure my day well.
So it's not really a weakness, but more a preference.
No.
I'm not sure if this is helping.
Yeah, that's why it's a crazy question. It's hard to imagine. I think the harder questions are when someone says, why were you fired from your last job? That's a harder one. And if you've been fired from your last job, or if COVID did something to your company, that's actually super common. And I actually don't worry about that a lot. But you have to have something ready. Just being caught unawares or not ready for those kinds of very difficult questions are derailing, or is derailing. So know that people are Googling you. You should be Googling them. If you have something slightly, let's say, different to your history, know that it might come up. Quite recently.
I just want to jump in. The most important thing is that you're honest. You should never, ever try to lie, or, you don't have to, on your resume, say you were fired, but if you have a criminal background or something like that, if by lying or, just not being truthful in any way, it can really come back to bite you.
The flip side, and Marnie, I know I've told you this story, is I had a client who had the identical name, and not a particularly common name, the identical name to somebody in another country who had a very unsavory background. And I was concerned on his behalf that the research into him as him was turning up results from somebody else, and it was hurting his chances. So my recommendation to him, and I will put this out there to you, is that if you think that something might come up that you are concerned about one way or another, there are services that you can hire to perform not background checks, reference checks on you for yourself. So you know what's coming up. So you know if there's somebody in another country with the same name as you who has a terrible history, you can find those things out and mitigate them in some way. So for his following interviews, I was rather hoping he'd be upfront and say, you know what, I did a search on my name and you'll never believe what I found, but that can't be me because I've not lived there. So I don't know what that's about, but just so you know that's out there. So that was a pretty unusual and specific circumstance, and yours might be different, but if you do have something in your history that might get uncovered or a reference that might not be treating you well, even as far as you might have researched them and chosen your references well, that's one way to figure out what's been going on.
And I think, we're going to talk about this next, but, you never want to badmouth, your former employer. So Sina was asking about questions related to what was your challenge at work. So, that could be an opportunity where what you might want to say, well, my boss was my challenge, but you don't want to do that. The challenges might be a really difficult project that you had to work on, within a very short time frame or with particularly challenging, individuals, and you want to show your success. So anytime that you're asked about a challenge at work, make sure it was something that turned out well, and so that you can, showcase that as an achievement. Should we move to the next one, Amy? Because I think after the interview, or during the interview, you might be asked with, do you have any questions for us? And so, you might be feeling a little bit like deer in the headlights at that point, where you have to come up with your own questions. So we wanted to share with you some samples of, what you might want to ask the employer or the hiring manager in an interview. So, what would the first week, month, year look like? How is good performance identified and measured? What are the traits of an ideal or good employee? And how does this position fit into the larger goals and culture of the company? So again, it's showing that you have it's more than just that you want a job to show up every day and do your thing at your desk. You're understanding the big picture of the culture of the organization, the larger goals, and how your role would fit in to help the business, achieve its goals. And that you're thinking about wanting to do well, right? If you're asking how is performance measured, you want to do well and you want to know how to meet those goals and tick off those boxes. So those are all good sort of forward thinking questions.
Should I keep going?
Sure.
This is what Marnie was referring to just a minute ago. Insofar as there's no such thing as not part of the interview, everything you say, everything you do, this takes up space in their head. A negative, critical approach or assessment of your prior role will stick with them. So even if your boss was horrible, you are not allowed to talk about that. Tell your cousin, tell your spouse, tell your dog, talk to a pillow, get it all out. You're allowed to have your own feelings. It's not that you're not supposed to have an opinion about what happened, but the interview was not the place to showcase it. On the positive side is make sure you have some things to say. Do the research, take a look at their website, note that they were in the news for something. It might not even be a question. Hey, I saw your press release on the release of your new product. How exciting. Tell me more about the product line, or tell me more about how that came to be. That's different from, what is it you folks do again? That's probably a non-starter. And anything that you can do to push it into the future and show that you are on the same side and part of the organization, even in a sort of framework kind of way. If I were part of this team, would I get to work on that product line? Is that part of the role? That's exciting, that kind of thing. that kind of thing. Frankly, any conversation that you have around your history or the opportunities in the role should be prospective in that way.
But let's add another what not to say in the interview, which is what Sina brought up, to ask about salary and benefits.
Oh,
At this point, it's too soon, right? Amy, would you agree that you wouldn't necessarily at this first interview ask about that?
I would never counsel somebody to ask at this stage, and almost not bring it up at all. It's really not the interviewee's place to do that. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't come prepared. So there are plenty of tools out there that you can use to figure out what the right salary or compensation for this type of position with this type of experience required, this type of authority. You can look at Glassdoor, salary.com, LinkedIn has a tool, Indeed has a tool. So know what you're getting yourself into. But if somebody says to you, would you take $15,000 a year for this job? You're not caught unawares. If 15, I just made that, but would you take 150,000 for this? That the only answer to that is this a job offer? Because otherwise you're boxing yourself in an unpleasant way. But if somebody says to you in the very first part of the interview, we're thinking that the salary range for this position is somewhere between 62,000 and 75,000. Does that sound reasonable? The only answer you can have before you know anything is, I'm confident we'll come to an equitable determination of compensation if and when we get there. Right now, let's talk about the job. This is super exciting. I want to know more. There's no way to answer the question otherwise.
So that answers Sina's question about what if they ask about my expectation. Amy, I wonder if you can almost say that sentence again. Maybe people want to jot it down because it's so helpful about, I think that you would probably want to say something about your expectations or, commensurate with experience or whatever the industry will bear, without giving a number.
So doing the research will help you understand the floor and the ceiling, what's reasonable. But if you can avoid saying a number, just be positive that this conversation is about the requirements of the role and the ways that you can exceed their expectations and the things that you bring to the table and the things that they want out of somebody for their ideal in their ideal candidate. But if they push you to give a number, don't give a single number, because that's really putting you in a very uncomfortable position. But you might say something like, my research has suggested that this role frequently, sort of across the board, it looks like this is somewhere between 62,000 and 62,000 and 75,000. But know that if you say 62,000 as your floor, you have to be comfortable with that number, because they may come back and say, well, you said that was fine. And now you have a conversation that you have to have if that's not good enough, if that's really not an expectation. So if you're doing the research and it's really 62 and 75, maybe you say 65 and 77. It's probably not that far off, but maybe you have to feel really confident in the numbers that you're offering up if they push you to that level. Otherwise, I'd say stay away.
Those are good questions. All right, so let's keep moving, because after the interview, after the bulk of the interview, you're going to get to the closing, right? And this is the point at which you don't want to just sort of leave and say, thank you very much for your time. You want to reiterate that you are interested in the job. You can ask specifically about what is the process, their process for decision-making, their timeline, their follow-up. So those would be good questions that we could add back onto that slide of, what are questions you might have. You might want to ask them, what is your process, your hiring process? What is your timeline? And when you conclude, make sure that you ask for the job. Tell them this sounds like a great match, a great opportunity, and that you would really, be honored to join their team, and that you really are confident that you could add value to their organization. So make sure that conclusion is strong. And, this is assuming you like what you've heard in the interview and you still still are interested. But remember that reiterating your interest at the end is really important.
Enthusiasm counts.
Definitely. So what happens after the interview? Let's go to the next one.
So the interview isn't over until everything's over. Everything to reframe my original statement, everything is still part of the interview. You're still in it even when you leave. Make sure that you have all of the information that you need, whether this is Zoom or face-to-face or however interviews turn out to be as this season progresses. Make sure that you follow up. My guess is, I don't know if there's real numbers, Marty, maybe you know the real numbers about how many people actually send follow-up thank you notes. But if you can send a thank you note to each of the people with whom you interviewed, and maybe some of the people you didn't interview with, maybe the receptionist was really, really helpful. Let's imagine a scenario in which you misplaced your umbrella and they found it for you. Send them a quick note, tell them thanks. You don't know how much of an influence people who can't hire you will be during your interview. And maybe that receptionist has been with the manager for 20 years and they are good friends. And that can go a long way. And I'm not saying go over the top, but an email to the people that you interacted with will set you apart, especially because, again, I don't know the numbers, but most people don't do it.
And would you recommend email or handwritten note?
So we were just talking about this, weren't we? I think email's faster. I think it's more of an expectation. I still don't think I come down on the side of texting, even if you've texted before. I think snail mail is too long. It takes too much time and people expect instantaneous responses. So even though the slide here says 24 hours, maybe do it that night. It doesn't have to be the minute you step out. And in fact, maybe you should take a little time to think about the things you want to reiterate, the points that you want to emphasize, your enthusiasm for the role. Take a little time to craft that. And you'll come out ahead compared to the people who probably are not doing it.
And the thank you note, it's not just saying thank you, but it's another opportunity for you to sell yourself again. So, if for example, if something didn't go quite right in the interview, maybe you feel like you didn't articulate something the way that you wanted to, or you forgot to say something, in the email, in addition to thanking them, you could say, I just want to go back to this one point, and you could clarify something or add something. So I do think that you should use this as another tool for them to get to know you. And I say go for it with an email and a handwritten note. I mean, how many people get actual snail mail that was like hand addressed? I mean, that's just so, I think it's meaningful if someone takes the time to do that. So I would say, if it's comfortable for you and you can get the information, I would do a handwritten note too. Because imagine that showing up 2 or 3 days later. I think that it makes you stand out.
I would be careful though. I appreciate what you're saying. And I think you're right that it does set a different level of communication and intentionality. But if people are working virtually, they may not get it. So don't neglect to write that email as well as that handwritten note. I would say do both.
That's absolutely right. I would say that my point goes for after COVID when people are actually in the office. So yes, exactly. At this point, a handwritten note probably wouldn't get to them. So that's an excellent point. If you're interviewed by more than one person virtually, do you ask for their emails after the interview for follow-up?
Or during.
Yeah. Or look for them on LinkedIn, call the receptionist and ask if you can get their information, but definitely thank everyone that you interviewed with.
And the recruiter, if you're working,
mm-hmm.
Well, I won't say you're working through the recruiter, the recruiter has found you. Make sure you're following up with them as well, and they'll give you really specific instructions about what to do.
So Sina had a question about if your resume gets booted out by the ATS, the applicant tracking system software, but you think someone should look at your resume or cover letter, would you recommend following up with them? At that point, I would say this gets right back into networking, which is, I'm so glad that you asked this, Sina. I would say if you can find someone in that company who you could email the resume to, and have them sort of walk it down and put in a good word for you, I could see that. But if your resume is getting kicked out and you feel like you still have the right skills and experience, I think you should look again at your resume and kind of figure out what's going on with it, that it's not making it through the ATS system. Would you agree, Amy?
Yeah, but I would also say spend 3% of your time applying online and 97% of your time building that network that counts. I think the latest industry facts and figures say that about 3% of jobs are filled through online, unsolicited resumes received online. So
Yes.
just consider that and know that it's them and not you. That much like the video interviewing, these are time savers for them and not so much favoring the applicant. So do what you need to do to make the right connections and sidestep that.
Yeah. So let's move to the last slide because we're actually getting close to the top of the hour. We want to encourage you as you think about your network to include us. We'd love to be part of that network and if we can help in any way. So our contact information is here for LinkedIn. And then we just want to wrap up by letting you know about a couple of handouts that you're going to get from, I believe John will send these to you in the next couple of days. But while we're wrapping up, if you have any sort of takeaways or what was like one thing that you learned today that really stuck with you, if you would just drop those in the chat, we'd love to, have those captured and read afterwards. So, we have a couple minutes left here. So drop anything in the chat that you will take away and will really help you in your networking and interviewing. So thank you in advance for sharing some feedback with us. And let me tell you about the 2 bonus handouts that you're going to get from John in the next couple of days. So one is called Networking Your Way to Your Next Job. And the other one is virtual and phone interviews. So these are 2 very detailed handouts that will sort of walk through everything that you need to know, everything that you need to think about to prepare and be really ready to put your best foot forward when it comes to networking and interviewing. And again, with COVID, everything is virtual and phone these days. I think there's probably very little face-to-face interviewing going on. So, the world is changing. The technology is really the way to go. And these handouts will help you with that. Next week, Amy, you want to talk about our topic for next week?
So next week, we're going to be talking about exactly what I was just talking about a minute ago. What to do with job boards, how to use them, and what to make of the applicant tracking software. I think I gave a little taste of what I think about them, but we'll talk about how to navigate that type of technology to your benefit so that you are using that time wisely and not the hamster in the wheel, doing what feels like work, but is really perhaps not in your service. So let's think about how to maximize your approach to these very, very prevalent technologies.
Yep. So Sina will talk more next week about that ATS, and hopefully, if your resume is getting booted, we'll help you figure out why that is and have you be more successful as well as all the rest of you. So thank you so much for being here and your questions and your interaction, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much.